She vanished after midnight. We thought it was just another missing girl. Then we found another body, and then another. 4 women, all wrapped in burlap, lined up like someone wanted us to find them. For 13 years, the trail ran cold. No names, no faces, just silence, until one man made a mistake. My name is Detective Miller, and this is the story of the Gilgo Beach Killer. Ocean Parkway. A lonely strip of road pinned between the Atlantic Ocean and the Great South Bay. In the summer, it's a quiet beach escape. In winter, it's cold, dead, and empty. The perfect place to hide something, or someone. It was December 2010 when the call came in. A cadaver dog had caught a scent off the side of the road. We were looking for a missing girl named Shannan Gilbert, a young escort who'd vanished after a panicked 911 call months earlier. But what we found wasn't her. It was someone else. Then a second body, a third, a fourth. In a matter of days, we uncovered a crime scene stretching nearly a quarter mile. All women, all posed the same. That's when we realized this wasn't a coincidence. This was the work of a predator. And worse, he was still out there, watching. My name is Detective Michael Miller. I've served with the Suffolk County Police Department for over 2 decades. In that time, I've seen a lot. Rage-fueled murders, overdoses turned tragic, disappearances that never got a name. But this case, this one was different. It didn't just pass through my file cabinet, it rooted itself in my bones. Not because of the violence, I've seen worse, but because of the silence, the precision, the patience. I still remember the night it began, December 2010. Ocean Parkway was empty, the wind slicing off the bay.
Unit 3, be advised. Possible remains located. Coordinates incoming.
The call wasn't unusual, but the dispatcher's pause, that hesitation, told me this was something else. We arrived before sundown. The sky was gray, flat, the kind of evening where time feels stuck. We parked just off the shoulder, boots sinking into soft sand. The canine unit was already tracking. A few minutes later, the dog stopped, barked once, then again. At first, we thought we'd found Shannan Gilbert, but the remains told another story. And then we found a second set, then a third, and a fourth, all women, all wrapped in burlap, carefully placed, as if staged. That was the moment everything changed. I've seen disorganized crime, the kind that spills out in chaos. This wasn't that. This was a message. Whoever did this had done it before, and they planned to do it again. I went home that night. My clothes still smelled like salt air and decay. I sat in silence, staring at the wall, files still in my hands. I told myself I'd leave it at work. I didn't. Even off duty, I drove back down Ocean Parkway more times than I can count. Same stretch of road, hoping to see what I missed the last time. I wasn't the only one who felt it. It wasn't just another body dump. It was a pattern no one wanted to say out loud yet, not until we had to. We didn't have a name, we didn't have a face, but we knew one thing for sure. He was still out there, and he was watching. Ocean Parkway, a narrow, winding stretch of road slicing across the barrier islands of Long Island. To the south, the open Atlantic. To the north, the quiet waters of the Great South Bay. And in between, sand dunes, tall reeds, and miles of silence. It runs for over 15 miles, a desolate ribbon of pavement where most people never stop unless they have to. There are no gas stations, no houses, no cameras. Just a road, and the wilderness on either side. During the day, it feels empty, peaceful even. But at night, it feels like the edge of the world. The first time I stepped out onto Ocean Parkway, I felt it in my bones. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, that dares you to speak just to break it. The kind of quiet that makes you realize you're truly alone. From a tactical standpoint, it was perfect. No surveillance, no foot traffic, no houses looking out over the dunes. The closest beach homes were half a mile away, buried behind dense brush and seasonal fencing. Half of them sat empty for 9 months out of the year. You could pull off the road, step out of your vehicle, and within 2 minutes, be out of sight. 3 minutes, and you could be back in the driver's seat, already gone. No one would see you. No one would hear her scream. And even if they did, no one would come. I've worked long enough to know. Most crimes are chaotic, rushed, improvised. But this place, Ocean Parkway, wasn't chosen out of panic. It was chosen with intent. If you wanted to disappear, or make someone disappear, this was the place. In the summer, the road felt alive. Families heading to the beach, joggers in neon vests, kids riding bikes 2 at a time. The air smelled like sunscreen and salt. The parking lots were full. People left footprints in the sand, even when they didn't mean to. But winter turned Ocean Parkway into a ghost town. The parking lots were chained off, the beach entrances closed. The only sounds were the wind, the ocean, and your own thoughts bouncing off the inside of your skull. The same stretch of beach that held laughter in July echoed nothing but cold wind in December. We laid out the map one afternoon, trying to understand what we were looking at. 4 women, all discovered in the same area. At first it felt random, coincidental, a tragic overlap. But when we marked their locations, something changed. They weren't scattered. They were aligned, almost perfectly. Gilgo Beach, where the first 4 bodies were found. Oak Beach, where Shannan Gilbert was last seen alive. Jones Beach, farther east, mentioned in later tips but never confirmed. We realized then, this wasn't careless dumping. It was methodical. Whoever did this had a pattern, a route, a ritual. I've walked a lot of crime scenes, some loud, chaotic, crawling with media and flashing lights, some quiet, almost sacred in the stillness they hold. But Ocean Parkway, that one felt different. I remember standing there after the others had gone, after the search dogs, the techs, even the medical examiner had packed up. I stayed behind. Just me, the sand, and the knowledge that something had happened here. Something wrong. Something that left a stain on the ground that no report could capture. I walked the edge of the road, boots pressing into loose gravel and packed earth. Every so often I'd stop, listen, nothing, no traffic, no birds, not even the creak of tree limbs in the wind. It was like the whole place was holding its breath. That's when I noticed the other tracks. Not fresh, not ours. They were older, wider, heavier, half faded, partially erased, but still there, like echoes pressed into the dirt. I couldn't prove it, but I felt it. He'd been here. He'd stood in this same spot, maybe even watching us, while we searched for the truth. We didn't know what we were standing on yet. We didn't understand the pattern. We didn't have a suspect, not even a real profile. But what we did have was a crime scene that spanned a mile. A stretch of coastline turned into a graveyard, and we were only just beginning to dig. Just a few feet from where I stood, the cadaver dog started barking. We may have something. We weren't looking for a body that day. We were looking for Shannan Gilbert. She'd been missing for months, last seen running barefoot through Oak Beach after a panicked 911 call. The whole thing didn't make sense, not on paper, not in the timeline. Some said she'd drowned, some said she'd run off, but something told us we were missing something big. So we went back to Ocean Parkway. Not to find a killer, just to find a girl. The morning was gray and bitter. Wind pushed in from the water, stinging your face like needles. We split into teams and started walking both sides of the road, just like we'd done a dozen times before. No one expected anything new. We had canine units, thermal scopes, cadaver dogs. I'd stopped counting how many times we'd walked that stretch. Brush, sand, tracks from deer, one discarded beer can. Then the dogs stopped. Ears stiff, nose low to the ground, tail frozen. The handler raised a hand. Everyone stopped moving. I moved in with him about 20 feet off the shoulder. There, hidden just beneath a clump of dune grass, something caught the light. A strip of rough, fibrous fabric. Burlap. We knew what it meant the second we saw it. Burlap doesn't blow in with the wind. It's heavy, it holds shape, and someone had taken time to wrap something inside it. The soil looked unsettled, lightly packed, like someone had tried to make it look untouched. But death always leaves a wrinkle in the dirt. I dropped to one knee, pulled my glove tight, brushed back the top layer of sand. And there she was, a young woman, partially decomposed, her hair matted into the fabric, her arms drawn in close, knees curled inward like she was trying to protect herself, even in death. We didn't know who she was at that moment, but we knew she wasn't Shannan, and we knew this was no accident. The scene went quiet. No chatter, no radio calls, just the sound of the wind and the low hiss of someone's breath behind me. I looked at the others, guys I've worked with for years, and none of us could meet each other's eyes. We'd all seen bodies before, but this was deliberate, clean, precise, like someone had done it before, like they knew how to cover their tracks. We called it in, secured the area. Forensics rolled in fast. Gloves on, camera shutters snapping, evidence markers getting placed. Someone handed me the preliminary field notes. No signs of trauma on the visible skin, no blood, no bruising. That's when the cold really hit me, not in my body, but in my chest. Whoever did this took their time. This wasn't rage. This wasn't panic. This was practice, and it wasn't random. I remember staring at her hands. One was curled in, the fingers frozen tight. The other, more relaxed, as if she'd given up halfway through fighting. In that moment, I stopped being a cop. I was just a man looking at someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who didn't deserve to die like that, buried in silence, hidden like trash. We didn't know her name, but we knew there were others like her out there. I stepped away for a moment, tried to breathe, but just a few yards down the line, the second dog started barking. I walked over, another patch of ground disturbed, another burlap sack. And just like that, we had 2 bodies, then 3, then 4. All women, all wrapped the same, all left within steps of each other. It wasn't a dumping ground, it was a message. If you'd asked me that morning what we were going to find, I would have said nothing. I was ready to file the report, tell the Gilbert family we'd tried again. But now I was standing in the middle of something much bigger than a missing person. I was standing on a graveyard, and we'd only just started digging. We hadn't even zipped the first body bag when the second dog barked. It was deeper into the brush, about 80 yards from where we found her. I remember someone muttering under their breath, "No way." But we followed the dog anyway. The second body was just like the first. Young woman, wrapped tight in burlap, face down, knees tucked. Not dumped, placed. There were no drag marks, no broken brush. Whoever left her there didn't panic. They'd been here before. They knew the terrain. The team around me froze. One guy just kept staring at the pattern in the sand where her body had settled, like he couldn't believe it was real. Me, I wasn't shocked. I was terrified. Not because of what we'd found, but because of what I already knew deep down. This wasn't going to stop at 2. We called it in. Suffolk County PD expanded the perimeter, more dogs, more men, more gear. We moved slowly, fanning out from the second site. By then, the wind had picked up, blowing in from the Atlantic, and the temperature was starting to drop. 3 hours later, third body. Same story, same burlap, same positioning. And this time something new, a strand of colored plastic, maybe from a hair extension, still tangled in her matted hair. Someone had tried to pull it out. Someone had wanted her anonymous. I remember I looked up from that third body and scanned the brush ahead. The pattern hit me in the chest. This wasn't random. These weren't accidents. They were in a line, straight, intentional, all about 100 feet apart, all just off the road, not too far to miss, if you were looking, not close enough to be seen unless you already knew. Someone wanted them to be found. But not all at once. It was like he was feeding them to us, breadcrumb by breadcrumb, years later. Just before sundown, we found the fourth. It was almost like the day had been counting down to her, and when we uncovered her, we knew. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a signature. By nightfall, Ocean Parkway had transformed from a quiet roadside to a full-blown command post. Floodlights were brought in, mobile crime scene vans lined the edge of the road. The cold didn't matter anymore. Everyone was numb, not from the weather, but from the weight of what we were seeing. 4 bodies, all young women, all carefully wrapped, all in a row. It felt organized. Calculated. We weren't dealing with someone out of control. We were dealing with someone disciplined, and that's what scared us most. We began piecing together initial observations. No IDs, no cell phones, no wallets, no jewelry. Nothing that could help us give these women back their names. That alone told us something. He didn't just kill them. He erased them. One tech whispered he didn't want us to know who they were. But he also didn't bury them deep, didn't scatter them. He posed them in burlap, like a signature, like a challenge. That night, back at the station, we laid out the GPS coordinates. And the line was undeniable. Body 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. Almost like mile markers. Almost like someone saying, "I've done this before, and I'll do it again." The next morning, we brought in more help. State police, FBI, profilers, cadaver dogs from out of state. They didn't question if it was a serial killer. They just asked, how many more? I remember sitting at my desk watching one of the CSI guys scroll through photos of the burlap. His voice was flat. This wasn't rage, this was ritual. And he was right. Each woman was spaced with intention. There was a rhythm to the placement, as if he wanted each one to be remembered, just not by name. We started rechecking missing persons reports. Sex workers, runaways, women with no family left to report them gone. It was overwhelming, pages and pages of faces, all young, all lost. And for years, no one had looked close enough. I remember thinking if we hadn't come here for Shannan, we'd never have found them at all. We still hadn't found her, by the way. Shannan Gilbert, the girl we came for, she was still missing. But we'd found 4 others, and something told me they were only the beginning.
Later that week, media got wind of the discovery, and everything changed. The news broke at 6:43 a.m. 4 bodies found along Ocean Parkway. Possible serial killer. That's what they ran with, and within hours it was everywhere. CNN, Fox, ABC, local radio, Reddit, Facebook. People didn't even know where Gilgo Beach was, but now it was on every screen in the country. I stood in the precinct that morning, staring at the headline on a coffee-stained laptop. Serial killer on Long Island. It felt surreal. We hadn't even finished identifying the victims, but the world had already decided what this was. By noon, reporters had taken over the roadside, tripods in the sand, helicopters overhead, boom mics stretching over police tape. One guy even climbed the roof of his van just to get a better shot of the brush. Ocean Parkway, once silent and still, now roared with attention. It was chaos. Someone from the FBI muttered, "We lost control of the narrative." He wasn't wrong. I was told not to talk to press. No one was. But they still asked questions, every minute, every direction. Are there more bodies? Do you have a suspect? Is it true they were all sex workers? Was this police negligence? The last one hit hardest, because truthfully, we'd missed them for years. They started digging into our records, FOIA requests, old 911 transcripts, social media accounts of missing girls no one had followed up on. We weren't just under pressure, we were under the microscope. The mayor gave a press conference, the chief stood beside him. All suits, all slogans. We will find whoever is responsible. We are treating this as an active homicide investigation. No resources will be spared. But the truth was, we were already behind. That night, I got home, sat on my couch, still in uniform, and watched one of the local news specials. They ran photos of the victims, well, reconstructions. We didn't know their names yet, but they had computer-generated sketches from forensics. They gave them nicknames: Jane Doe number 1, Beach Victim 2, Unidentified Female Burlap. That's all they were for now, nameless faces. And that's when it hit me hardest. No one cared until they became headlines. One woman called the station the next morning. Her sister had gone missing in 2009, also an escort. She said she filed a report, but no one ever called her back. There were others like her, mothers, aunts, old roommates, people who had searched alone, without flyers, without police, without help, and now finally had a reason to speak up. They started showing up at the barrier, holding framed photos, holding signs. Some of them were angry, some just wanted answers. One held a sign that read, "She wasn't disposable." My daughter was more than what you call her. She was funny, she was smart, she had a son. She just got lost. That doesn't mean she deserved this. I remember watching that clip on a TV at the precinct. No one spoke for a long time. Over the next few weeks, we held briefing after briefing. The press kept pressing the same angle. Is there a serial killer on Long Island? We weren't ready to say it publicly, but inside the department, we knew. And once we said the words out loud, we couldn't take them back. I kept thinking about the way he left them. 4 women, all young, all forgotten, until now. And I kept thinking about what would have happened if we hadn't gone back out there to look for Shannan. If that dog hadn't barked, if the burlap had stayed covered, if no one had ever looked again, how many more would he have added? I didn't sleep much that month. None of us did. Not because of the case files, not because of the scene photos, but because of the weight. Because when a killer hides 4 women in plain sight for years and no one notices, you don't just question the killer, you start to question yourself. The public wanted answers, the families wanted justice, the department wanted to look competent. And me? I just wanted to find the rest of them before he did. And we hadn't even started to understand just how many there were. We thought we found the worst of it, but the worst was still coming. For the next decade, the case went silent. After the initial wave of headlines and press conferences, things faded. The cameras left, the crowds disappeared, and Ocean Parkway returned to what it had always been, still, quiet, watching. 4 women had been found, 4 lives taken. But the trail? Cold. There were no arrests, no suspects, and worst of all, no names. Investigators combed through missing persons lists, but DNA testing took time, and public interest began to drift.
In tonight's update on the Gilgo Beach case, officials say no new leads have been developed. Families of the victims continue to demand answers.
Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. There were whispers of police mismanagement, even corruption. Reports emerged that early 911 calls had been mishandled and that vital evidence had been ignored. A cloud settled over the Suffolk County Police Department.
We acknowledge mistakes were made early in the investigation, but we are committed to seeing this case through.
But commitment wasn't enough. The years rolled by, and the killer, if he was still out there, remained untouched. Some believed he had moved on. Others feared he'd stop because he didn't need to continue. He'd already proven what he needed to. In 2016, the police chief was removed. Internal politics bled into public view. Families grew more vocal, more frustrated. The FBI offered support, but the case continued to stall. Even the name, the Gilgo Beach Killer, began to fade from headlines. But for the people who lived near Ocean Parkway, for the families who never got closure, and for those of us who still remembered what we found in the sand, it never faded. We were just waiting for something, anything, to bring this case back to life. What we didn't know was it would be technology, not a witness, that would break the silence. And it was coming soon. For 13 years, we were chasing a ghost. 4 women, all posed the same way, all left like trophies in the sand. We walked the same stretch of road again and again. We dug up tip lines. We followed false leads. We waited for that one lucky break. And when it finally came, it didn't feel lucky. It felt like a long overdue reckoning. It started in early 2022 when the new district attorney reassembled a special task force to re-examine everything. I was brought back in, older, slower, but still holding on to every piece of that road like it was stitched into my memory. And I wasn't alone. We had new tools now, new eyes, new urgency. The first thing we looked at? The burner phones. They were always a dead end in 2010. Cheap, prepaid, registered under fake names. But what the killer didn't account for back then was how much digital forensics would evolve. We ran a fresh trace on the burner phones used to contact the 3 victims we'd linked together: Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello. The data wasn't perfect, but it gave us something we never had before: geofencing. Cell tower records showed that each of the burners had connected from 2 specific locations over and over again: Midtown Manhattan during working hours and Massapequa Park at night. That narrowed it down, way down. We ran the list, cross-referenced employee directories, DMV records, cell tower hits, utility bills, and one name kept coming up: Rex Heuermann. I'd never heard of him. No record, no complaints, just a name on paper. But the more we looked, the more it lined up. He had a business address on Fifth Avenue, an architecture firm. Lived in Massapequa with his wife and 2 kids. Drove a green Chevy Avalanche, just like the one a witness remembered outside Amber Costello's house the night she disappeared. He didn't hide in the shadows. He was right there, living a double life. We started surveillance. Nothing aggressive, just patient. Long days, boring hours. He left for work like clockwork, always alone, never rushed. Sometimes he'd sit in his car for 20 minutes before going inside, just scrolling his phone. We needed more. In January 2023, one of our guys tailed into lunch. He stopped for pizza, sat by himself, ate slow, and when he tossed the crust into a street bin and walked off, we moved. We bagged it, labeled it, sent it to the lab. It felt like a long shot, but a few weeks later the call came. DNA from the crust matched mitochondrial DNA found on the burlap used to wrap Amber Costello. It wasn't a perfect ID, but it was a direct link. Our ghost now had skin and blood. We built the case piece by piece. Those same burner phones had pinged near the victims' homes. In some cases, they moved with the victims, tracking their last known locations. Then they'd go silent just before the murders. Then, hours or about them. He downloaded podcasts about the Gilgo case. We even found forums where he'd commented anonymously. He wasn't just killing. He was following the fallout, like a collector admiring his own work. In one case, he called Melissa Barthelemy's sister using the victim's phone, days after the murder. He whispered, he laughed, and then he hung up. That call never left me, because it wasn't just cruel, it was personal. With enough circumstantial evidence and the DNA link from the pizza, we got the warrants. On July 13, 2023, we arrested Rex Heuermann outside his Manhattan office. He didn't fight, didn't ask questions. He looked blank, like we'd interrupted a meeting he wasn't finished with. Back at his house in Massapequa Park, we searched every inch. What we found was worse than we imagined. More than 280 firearms, some legal, some illegal. Dozens of burner phones, some used, some still sealed. Boxes of hard drives, hand-drawn maps of Long Island's coastline, and pages of searches like how to dispose of a 120-pound body, how serial killers get away with it, Gilgo Beach victim list. He was obsessed with control, with death, with his own legend. His family, they were out of town during the killings, no signs they knew. But I still wonder, how do you live with someone like that and never see it? We charged him with 3 murders. We're confident he's responsible for a 4th, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, but we're still compiling the forensics. He pled not guilty, hired a lawyer, denied everything. When the news broke, the media storm hit like a tidal wave. We stood behind a podium and told the world we'd finally found the man behind the burlap. And I looked into those cameras and said it with all the weight of the last 13 years on my shoulders. This is not over, but for the first time, it feels like we're finally standing on solid ground. Even now, as I record this, he's sitting in a jail cell, waiting, watching. He hasn't said much, but he doesn't have to. The evidence is already screaming.
What haunts me isn't the horror of what he did, it's how long he got away with it. 13 years. Families shattered. Women forgotten. And a predator who lived among us, smiling behind blinds. There are still bodies we haven't linked. Still gaps in the timeline. Still questions about Shannan Gilbert, the woman we were originally searching for when this all began. But for the first time in a long time, the sand is giving up its secrets. And every time I drive down Ocean Parkway now, I don't just see brush and dunes. I see graves. I see girls who never came home. And I see the man who thought we'd never find him. But we did, and we're not done yet. The arrest was only the beginning. We had a name, a face, a man in handcuffs. But justice isn't a moment, it's a process. And this process was far from over. After 13 years of waiting, the families were finally promised their day in court. But even then, none of us believed it would be simple. Because once you pull back the curtain on a case like this, what you see behind it is rarely clean. In August 2023, the Suffolk County District Attorney officially charged Rex Uriman with 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. He pled not guilty. Sat motionless in court. No visible emotion, no glance at the gallery, just a man behind thick glasses, expression blank. His lawyer called the evidence circumstantial, flawed, not definitive. But we knew better. We'd seen the threads. We'd followed them to his front door. What followed was months of preparation. Discovery, motion hearings, evidentiary reviews, nothing flashy, just grinding work behind the scenes. What the public saw were headlines. What we saw were hours of data, burner phone triangulations, digital search histories, GPS logs, surveillance footage, DNA chain of custody forms, expert witness prep, and beneath all that, unanswered questions, because here's the truth. We could prove 3 murders. We had solid evidence for a 4th, Maureen Brainerd Barnes. But the bodies didn't stop at 4. There were at least 10 more, found in the same marshland stretch. And only some matched Uriman's method. The rest? They raised more questions than answers. Let's talk about Shannan Gilbert. She was the reason we found any of this in the first place. Back in 2010, we were searching for her, not a serial killer, not a burial site. She made a 911 call, hysterical, begging for help, ran through Oak Beach, vanished. Her body was discovered over a year later in the opposite direction of the Gilgo 4, in a marsh, no obvious trauma, no concrete cause of death. Some claimed it was an accident, others said she drowned. But I've listened to that 911 call, start to finish, and I don't believe she just wandered into a swamp and died. Still, for now, her case remains separate. So do the other remains we found nearby. A toddler, an Asian male, partial remains of women who vanished years earlier. Some weren't escorts, some didn't match the known victims' profiles. Different disposal methods, different locations.
And that left us with a haunting possibility.
In the early days, we dismissed that idea. Too convenient, too chaotic. But over time, inconsistencies started stacking up. Heuermann's phone data put him near 3 murders, but not all of them. His pattern, meticulous, methodical, didn't line up with some of the more chaotic dump sites. The timing didn't match, the execution didn't match. Were these copycats, or partners, or just someone who used the same killing grounds? We don't know, and we're still looking. Publicly, we can't say much more, but internally, task force files are open. DNA from the older remains is being retested. We're scanning decades of missing persons reports, cross-referencing every woman who ever vanished within a 100-mile radius. And we're getting calls, tips, rumors, theories. Some wild, some plausible. Every day, this case gets bigger instead of smaller. Meanwhile, the media storm hasn't stopped. Journalists swarm the courthouse at every hearing. Documentary crews want interviews, podcasts want exclusives. Everyone wants to know what kind of man hides this much darkness in such a normal shell. But what they don't always show you is the weight. The detectives who've carried this for over a decade. The families still waiting on full closure. The forensics team still working 14-hour days, reviewing fibers and timestamps and anonymous tips. This case didn't end when Rex Heuermann was arrested. It just changed shape. I keep thinking about one detail. It wasn't some grand confession that cracked the case. It wasn't a dramatic shootout or a slip of the tongue. It was a slice of pizza, DNA on crust, a quiet moment that changed everything. That's how these cases go. Monsters hide behind spreadsheets, behind family photos, behind driveways that get shoveled every winter. But they always leave something behind. Always. We still don't know how many lives this man destroyed. We may never know. The evidence we have is solid, but it only explains part of the story. It doesn't explain the unidentified victims. It doesn't explain the years of silence. And it certainly doesn't explain how he kept it hidden for so long. Sometimes, the truth we can prove is smaller than the truth we suspect. The trial is set for 2025. Heuermann remains in custody, held without bail. He rarely speaks, never acknowledges the families, just sits and listens, stone-faced, unreadable. And every time he walks into that courtroom, I look at him and think, you thought you were smarter than everyone. You thought you'd never be caught. But you weren't, and you were. Even if he's convicted, this case isn't over. The ground out there still holds secrets. There are still missing women we haven't named, still families who haven't heard a knock on their door. Justice moves slow, but it moves. And if there's one thing I've learned in this job, it's this. The dead don't stay buried forever. Every time I drive past that stretch of road, Ocean Parkway, I remember where this started. Not with a press conference, not with a mugshot, but with a call for help. A woman running barefoot in the night, a dog catching a scent in the sand, and 4 bodies waiting to be found. That stretch of land gave up its dead, and now it's giving up its truths one layer at a time. We're not done, and neither is the case. A conviction, if it comes, won't bring the victims back. It won't rewrite the 13 years of silence, but it will mean something to the families, to us, to the way we do things from now on. Because after a case like this, you don't just walk away unchanged. In the months after Heuermann's arrest, things started shifting, quietly but noticeably. Calls that used to take weeks to get attention were suddenly prioritized. Reports of missing sex workers weren't dismissed the way they had been. Detectives stopped asking, was she on drugs, and started asking, when did you last hear from her? The stigma, that old quiet bias, began to crack. Because for over a decade, we'd told ourselves that these women were invisible, that their choices made them less. But they weren't less. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and someone hunted them like prey. And once we looked that truth in the eye,
it became harder to look away.
They take the phone, place on them.
I started seeing change even in small-town departments. Patrol officers now carry laminated cards with high-risk indicators for missing persons. We share case files across jurisdictions faster. We've updated protocols on how long to wait before opening an investigation. Before Gilgo, we hesitated. Now, we move.
Because we learned sometimes the first 48 hours aren't just important, they're everything. But it's not just the police that changed. The public changed too. I've spoken at schools, town halls, community watch meetings. The questions parents ask now, different. They don't ask about curfews, they ask about digital safety, about how to talk to their kids when they go online, about how predators operate quietly through screens, apps, shadows. Young women, especially those living on the edges, working alone, living paycheck to paycheck, they've told me they think differently now. They notice who follows them home. They tell a friend where they're going. Some even carry small GPS trackers just in case. It's not fair that they have to, but it's real. And I'd rather they be over-prepared than not make it back. I also saw something shift in the families. Some found peace, some didn't. But nearly all of them found purpose. They started foundations. They lobbied for legislation. They worked with lawmakers to pass Gilgo bills, measures to protect missing persons cases from being closed too early or under-investigated. One father told me, if I couldn't save my daughter, maybe I can help save someone else's. And I believe he will. As for me, I've stood on crime scenes most of my life, but something about this case stuck deeper than the others. Maybe it was the silence of it, the way these women disappeared without screams, without sirens, just gone. Or maybe it was because it made me realize how broken our radar can be. We're trained to look for chaos, blood, glass, alarms, but monsters don't always bring noise. Sometimes they just bring a trash bag and a flashlight. And if we don't listen close, we miss them entirely. There's still a stretch of Ocean Parkway that I don't drive unless I have to. It looks the same as it always did. Sand, brush, dark asphalt, but I can't see it the same. Because every turn reminds me of a body, of the girls who waited there, hoping someone would come find them. And eventually we did, but not fast enough. Some nights I ask myself how many more are still out there. Buried, abandoned, missing from the systems that were supposed to protect them. I don't know. But I know this, they're watching us now. The public, the press, the next generation of detectives. And that pressure is a good thing. It means the shadows don't stretch as far as they used to. It means the next time a woman disappears, someone might actually listen the first time. This case won't be the last of its kind, I'm not naive, but it might be the last time we wait this long to take it seriously. And if that's what comes out of all this, then something good has lived inside the horror. Because the thing about echoes is, they don't stop at the last word. They keep going. Long after the verdict, long after the cameras leave, long after the names fade from the headlines. And if we're smart, we'll keep listening. Because the dead, they still speak. And it's our job to hear them. If this story moved you, I ask just one thing. Let it live a little longer. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. Tell us where you're watching from. And if you want to walk with us through more stories like this, subscribe. We don't chase headlines, we chase truth, even when it hides in the dark.